Hey everybody, this is section 7 of, or chapter 7 of Hillel Ticktin's The Origins of the Crisis in the USSR. This section is called The Nature of the Soviet Political Economy. And its sections include, first section, Control over Labor in the Brezhnev Period, the laws and contradictions of the system, growth and disintegration. So, here we go. What page are we going to? I'm going to say 126. Ah, so close. Alright. Let me see. And let me get down to, let me open a separate tab for the endnotes. So let's see, 144. Let's see if I get it right. All right, it looks like we're in business. So here we go. First section, Control over Labor in the Brezhnev Period. All problems go back to labor. Footnote. Sonin puts the issue of economic problems squarely in terms of labor. Because Sonin is an establishment economist, the conclusion must be that the essence of the problem is obvious in the context of a system that does not have commodity production. End footnote. The slowness of the introduction of new technology, egalitarianism in pay, overmanning, the large repair sector are all a consequence of the inability of enterprise managers to do anything but concede to workers. The special character of the Brezhnev period lay precisely in these concessions. It was a period of social peace because the elite preferred to concede to the workers rather than take them on. The initial reforms under Kosygin were dropped in favor of partial attempts at control, which only increased the size of the controlling apparatus while having little long-term effect. This was a considerable contrast with the attempts made under Khrushchev to find organizational forms of control. It was even more of a contrast with the Stalin period when direct force was employed. From the point of view of the elite, workers can be controlled by compulsion, through an incentive system mixed with administrative measures, or through the market. The elite have tried all three at different times, and there can be no doubt that the market is the preferred solution. The problem is that it means a direct confrontation with workers or peasants when the peasants had any economic power. The regime used force with the peasants and workers under Stalin, although the regime used other forms of control as well. But once the scope of force as a mode of control was reduced, an alternative had to be found. Under Khrushchev, the removal of direct force initially had its own incentive effect. Nonetheless, pressure was being applied to raise output through administrative measures. This was extended under Brezhnev, but in such a half-hearted way that little change in fact occurred. The economic reforms were abandoned. The Shchekino experiment ultimately failed. Fulfillment of plans through realization in money terms meant little as long as volume quotas remained. Through all the talk of the Brezhnev era, the situation of the workers did not materially worsen. Gorbachev is very different. Gorbachev stands for a confrontation with the workers. The Brezhnev group preferred a strategic retreat, whereas the present regime sees attack as the best means of defense. Aghanbegyan and the forces around Aghanbegyan are attempting a rollback of the position of the workers as far as possible. This is not a new position, but the considerable gains made by workers under Brezhnev, just because of the nature of the socialization of industry and the cowardly nature of the elite, give the issue immediacy. New section. The laws and contradictions of the system. The fundamental contradiction of the Soviet system lies in the form of control over the workers, through their atomization. This necessarily leads to a decline in productivity and hence to a lower standard of living for the workers than would otherwise be the case. It also means that the elite are deprived of the power to direct the productive forces in a manner they would regard as efficient. This contradiction intensifies over time as the socialization of production increases workers' power. As a result, efficiency actually declines even if output goes up. The nature of the waste changes. In the early period, workers directly sabotaged production, took time off, had high labor turnover, whereas in the post-Stalin period the norm became the focal point of the struggle. This represented a movement from a more individualistic to a less individualistic form of struggle. The logic of this movement is that workers will collectively decide on the norm, instead of having it decided on the basis of bargaining between management and skilled and older workers. Hence, the new regime has decided that the norm has to be decided by more reliable elements. It is easier to deal with workers who act on an entirely individualistic basis, but more difficult when workers begin to act, even if unconsciously, in their own class interests. Hence the Brezhnev retreat. There appears, then, to be a law of the Soviet regime. It is not one of increasing waste as put forward by Antonio Carlo, since the waste of the 1930s with the death of millions from starvation is incomparable, but is rather a law of increasing inefficiency or growing gap between potential output for the consumer and actual output. Footnote. Two footnotes. Bob Arnault, Controlling Soviet Labor, and Antonio Carlo, The Crisis of Bureaucratic Collectivism. I have The Crisis of Bureaucratic Collectivism on the channel. Bob Arnault's Controlling Soviet Labor was published in 1988. And the description says, with a growing population, deteriorating economic conditions, and an unstable imperial center, Soviet Central Asia would seem destined to become a trouble spot. Okay, that's not the correct. Fuck that. That's annoying. There's no. That's not the. Yeah, the description is not correct. Anyway, forget that. I was going to look up that book. Back to the text. Sorry. And footnote. I'm going to repeat the last sentence because it seems important. The law of the Soviet regime is not one of increasing waste as put forward by Antonio Carlo, since the waste of the 1930s with the death of millions from starvation is incomparable, but is rather a law of increasing inefficiency, or a growing gap between potential output for the consumer and actual output. Thus, the inefficiency of Department 1 as documented by Soviet figures is perhaps graphically shown by the simple fact that expenditure on capital, repairs of machinery and equipment came to 8,670 million rubles in 1986 as opposed to just 288 million for light industry. Footnote. Something in Russian. End footnote. These figures also graphically bring out the real expenditure on the different sectors. As indicated above, light industry had a lower percentage of incomplete projects and a worse increase in cost-to-output ratio. This leads to the conclusion that Department 1 has an enormous expenditure on repairs and incomplete projects. It also, as a result, appears more efficient in its, quote, capital output ratios. Since these figures also reflect pricing policy, not too much can be read into them except for the fact that light industry is the Cinderella of the regime. A society engaged in producing ever more machinery that has little impact on consumption, even for the elite and the intelligentsia, is a peculiar phenomenon. The real point is that it is of this kind for one reason only. Its own inefficiency makes it very difficult to produce the machinery required for light industry. The fundamental law of the regime is one of a conflict between organization and the individual interest of the unit. Put empirically, the regime itself is a regime where there is a permanent and endemic conflict between the need of the center to control and develop the system in the interest of those who control, and opposition by all units below the center. The problem is that there is no inbuilt mechanism for reconciling this conflict. It is useful at this point to summarize the argument provided elsewhere. This starts from the view that the USSR is rent by two conflicting laws, a law of organization and a law of self-interest. The term, quote, law, expresses the objective and necessary nature of the two features of the regime. There is, therefore, no method for the center to achieve its object by coordinating its units, and so the workers to its needs. A law is a description of the process of movement of the poles of a contradiction. The two opposing poles of the law of self-interest are the atomized worker and socialized labor. The law of organization has as its poles central control and the specific interest of the elite. In a socialist society, the law of planning would be dominant, and here the contradiction would lie in central planning as opposed to the concrete requirements of the individual citizen. The development of the USSR has been specific in that the original laws of value and planning have degenerated into the new forms described above. The difference between the USSR and a planned society is that the USSR is centralized control in the interest of a small group. The elite, bureaucracy, or ruling group, the term is of no importance. In a socialist society, on the other hand, the centralized control is in the interest of the society as a whole. The immediate effect of the difference in the nature of a socialist society and that of the Soviet Union is that an insuperable opposition is created between those being, quote, planned and the planners. As a result, the central, quote, planners have to take this into account and compromise, and hence, rather than control, they have to organize and bargain, often to the detriment of the interest of the elite itself. The interest of the elite then expresses itself, and a dynamic is set up to provide a mediation, which quickly breaks down. For instance, it is in the interest of the organizers to have higher norms, or at least ones that conform to technical specifications. But organizers know that such pressure is counterproductive unless they normally bargain for a practical figure. The result is that the economy is worse off, goods are not delivered, discontent rises over time, and the position of the elite is threatened. A new solution is required. It is in the interest of the elite to maximize control over the surplus product for the elite's own ends, which can be reduced to the elite's need for occupational stability and access to privileges. This can only be achieved if each member of the elite has individual control over a portion of the surplus product. Since they do not have such individual control, they exist in a position of permanent instability and constant attempts to exert centralized control over the direct producers. In principle, the achievement of full control over the surplus product, and so the labor process, would then achieve the stability required and permit the division of the surplus product among individuals, depending on their personal degree of control over that product. As a result, the law of organization expresses the permanent tension that exists between the need to organize the economy on a centralized basis and the real needs of the elite. This may appear to contradict the view that the elite often introduce measures that increase the degree of centralization rather than the reverse. However, the reason for this paradox lies precisely in the fact that since their, quote, planning of the economy conflicts with the interests of the direct producers, it also conflicts with the interest of all units in the system. Hence, the latter constantly reinterpret all commands in their own interests. Logically, this has led to attempts to avoid such reinterpretation by concentrating as much detailed organization as possible in the center. This was the economic meaning of the Purge period, and it has led to the emergence of a section of the elite that is more interested in enforced control than in organization. Such a movement to total control is a chimera that has failed and must necessarily fail. Hence, this group of controllers can only be regarded as a retrogressive section of the elite, constantly recreated by the nature of their unstable position, growing weaker as the economy itself grows more industrialized. The law of organization, therefore, shows the law of organization's self in constant attempts by the elite either to centralize or to decentralize, depending on the time and the degree of strength held by one or another faction of the elite. The reason for this hopeless position lies in the fact that elite control is opposed by the direct producers. The elite thus stand in a peculiar position, unique in human history. They control the surplus product but do not control the labor process. As a result, the elite find that they cannot fully control the surplus product. In turn, to assert control over the surplus product, as today, they try expedients to dominate labor, whether through quality control, raising norms, unemployment, or whatever. The exact form is of no consequence. They cannot succeed in their attempts to control labor, but the history of the USSR is a history of such attempts. Struggle as they may, they are impaled on their own contradiction. Their own interests cannot be ensured through centralized control that can only be maintained for a limited time. The more they struggle to centralize control or organize the economy, the more the elite socialize the workers and the more difficult it becomes to run the USSR centrally. If the elite decentralize the organization of the economy, then the law of self-interest takes over and the individual units ignore the center, creating either chaos, the market, or an evolution toward democracy. In fact, events appear to follow the above sequence. The more decentralization proceeds, the more chaotic the regime becomes. Order is only maintained through individual units organizing direct trading. Such events challenging the system in its social relations. The workers then become restive when prices are raised against the workers, unemployment rises, etc. This kind of result appears itself to be a law of history. Thus, for instance, we may read the following, quote, "The World Bank estimates that 10% of the industrial workforce will be laid off as uncompetitive enterprises collapse. This will only increase the unemployment caused by the liquidation of parastatal enterprises. While food prices rise, wage increases will be contained. Labor code modifications demanded by the bank will allow employers to hire cheap labor ineligible for Social Security benefits." End quote. That's from Senegal Revives in Freer Economic Climate. The Financial Times, 6th of January, 1988. Such drastic action, now being applied to Senegal, a small African country, is exactly the medicine being taken by the USSR. The great difference is that the working class of the USSR is incomparably stronger and the elite weaker. This remedy is indeed the only method of ensuring a successful economy with a ruling group in control. Yet there is no way that the workers can be either forced or tricked into accepting it. The very existence of the control over labor provided by nationalization has established an elite or ruling social group in a number of countries over. The problem is that the control can be maintained by direct force, and therefore creates that control's own dynamic. The difference between the USSR and all other small countries is not only that it is the first to perform in this manner, but more importantly, is the only one to have been based on the working class, and it now has a massive working class opposed to it. It is not enough to possess control over labor, because the instruments of control must also be present to ensure that the alienation of labor power can be enjoyed. Force is too blunt a method of control to succeed under industrial conditions. Shit. Where am I? Sorry, I accidentally pressed the wrong button. Thus, the elite is necessarily driven first one way, toward maximum force as in the time of the purges, and then another way, toward bargaining in organizational forms, as under Khrushchev. In so moving, they have split themselves. The third way, back toward the market, and ultimately capitalism, becomes ever more attractive as the factions of the elite demonstrate their impotence. The factionalization is only a symptom of the failure of the use of force and its concomitant, the squeezing of ever more labor time to ensure growth, including the intensification of labor. The need for the direct producers to act... footnote. Since 1979, and indeed somewhat earlier, labor turnover and labor discipline have considerably improved. End footnote. The need for the direct producers to act lies in their alienated position as workers who alienate their labor power and hence do not control the surplus product these direct producers themselves produce. Without interest in production, life is made tolerable by established control over the work process. From the point of view of the elite, this is acceptable insofar as it enforces the atomization of the direct producers, who relate to their own individual work process and not to the society as a whole, or even to the factory as a whole. The problem is that it stands opposed to the real social division of labor, and hence lowers productivity and above all elite control to an unacceptable level. As a result, the elite then attempt to centralize or decentralize depending on political exigencies. The problem then is a problem that is insuperable in the context of the USSR. It has to be noted that the two laws of the USSR are a degeneration of the law of value and of the law of planning, but in a scrambled form. No new synthesis or suppression can result from the conflict of these laws, only stagnation. The conflict has given rise to a process of stagnant growth, stalemated social relations, and constant attempts by the elite to find a way out. On the other hand, since each law is itself an expression of a contradiction, it is being superseded. The elite must either give way to central planning or abolish central planning. The workers have to take control over socialized labor or be atomized under commodity fetishism, i.e. the market, The complexity of the USSR is expressed through the existence of two conflicting laws and contradictions of the society expressing themselves differently in each law. Of course, the USSR is part of a wider world, where indeed centralized organization, planning, or direction is in fact increasing, whatever Reagan and Thatcher may have attempted. In capitalism, this is an inherent contradiction, the increasing socialization of production standing opposed to the ever smaller numbers in control over surplus value. Value is nothing if not atomized spontaneity, but to exist today it must organize, must use bureaucratic instruments, and must have a long-term policy. This is complex enough, but in the USSR this same inexorable process has taken on its own more contradictory form. The socialized division of labor has been, as it were, split apart. On the one hand, it requires planning, which has become the exclusive province of the elite, while on the other it stands over but not above the worker. Under capitalism, by contrast, the socialized division of labor stands opposed to the capitalist, expressing the nature of both the working class and the future society. In the USSR, the socialized division of labor has to be utilized by the elite and becomes a form of control over the worker. Whereas socialized labor provides the basis for the strength of the worker, in the USSR, socialized labor has been turned into its opposite. From the point of view of the elite, it is their method of appropriation of the surplus product, and from the point of view of the workers, it is the method of control over the workers. The workers, however, the latter, however, is achieved by splitting the surplus product from the surplus product's labor process, so that the worker controls the labor process, but not the product, in an individualized form. Thus, the worker is doubly controlled. The worker's product is held by others, and the worker's work process is such that he is separated from his fellow workers. The dynamic in society is provided by the movement of the process of socialized production. The more socialized the nature of labor and so production, i.e. the more integrated the division of labor, the more difficult it is for the worker to be atomized around his labor process, and more difficult it is for the elite to obtain compliance with their commands. Democracy becomes an ever-present necessity. The elite are driven by their position as organizers of the economy to expand it, in order to buttress their own control. This is done both by assuaging the demands of the workers for consumer goods, more jobs, more creative jobs, i.e. social mobility, etc., by their own needs to maintain control. New section, growth and disintegration. It is, of course, a common view that the elite prefer to produce heavy industrial goods because this provides them with untrammeled power. There can be no question that producer goods, unlike consumer goods, are not rejected by millions of consumers and therefore appear to be less subject to democratic process. This may be true, but it is insufficient to explain why Department 1, the means of production department, expands faster than the means of consumption department. After all, the elite could maintain themselves as controllers of large car plants rather than as the directors of large construction works or energy plants. That cars would have to be better than machine tools is questionable. There is no democracy in the market at all. Under capitalism, the poor put up with shoddy goods and the very rich get goods of the highest quality. Under conditions of shortage, everyone is glad to get what they can, however unreliable. The machine tool industry is enormous in the USSR, but this is in large part a consequence of the unreliable nature of its products and the technologically backward nature of the industry. It has indeed been counterproductive to have a gigantic industrial machine that is greater than any other in its producer goods sector, but that consistently produces a consumer goods mouse? Or moose? I don't fucking know. Thus, light industry grew by 9% in the period of 1980 to 86, and engineering grew by 46% in the same period. The greater absurdity is that, in spite of the growth of the producer goods sector, technological equipment for light industry grew by 31%, and the stock of metalworking machinery is actually aging. Clearly, this has nothing to do with the need to find places for managers, but everything to do with the supreme inefficiency of a system that has no place in history. Obviously, if industry cannot keep pace with the demands of its own heavy industry, there is no hope whatsoever of providing goods for light industry. It is logical to expect that the problems of the relations between sectors will worsen over time. After all, the needs of the producer goods department can only increase. The producer goods department needs technologically newer goods, more sophisticated repairs, and, given the nature of the USSR, even more repairs than before. It requires new plants, more construction of newer divisions, and newer sources of raw materials. In principle, there is no need for Department 1 ever to produce any goods that are developed for the utility of the individual, which even under capitalism is the ultimate destiny of goods and services. The growth in technology, repairs, and construction is never ending, as long as the surplus product is controlled by the few against the many. The many workers have no interest in their alienated product, and the elite have no individual interest in a product destined for others. Collectively, the elite is interested in more and better goods, but individually, the elite's interests are best served in smoothing the system along, permitting themselves to be seen as happy and successful bureaucrats. The reason, then, for the lack of consumer goods lies in the fact that they are the end product of a process of production that never reaches its logical end. The split in the division of labor, then, has shown itself in the detailed working of the economy. Production is split from consumption, consumer goods from producer goods, the product from the product's repair, new technology from old technology, and newer plants from older plants. In every respect, a dichotomy appears that cannot be bridged. The capitalist contradiction between use value and exchange value is replaced by antagonisms in every aspect of society. This is as it should be, because it is in the nature of value that it provides a solution to otherwise antagonistic relations, whereas in the USSR such relations coalesce to support the two conflicting laws of the society. With such a conflictual society, there is a special role for the organizers to hold it together, but since they cannot hold it together, the society begins to disintegrate. We may summarize this analysis by referring to the process of growth. The elite are themselves based on the necessity of growth, precisely to avoid the disintegrating nature of the society. Growth is the only means whereby some consumer goods can be produced, some mobility ensured, and stagnation avoided. As long as the absolute surplus was expanding, their problems were containable. Once the relative surplus ceased to expand, they came up against insuperable problems. Society simply had to be fully integrated to allow the relative surplus to expand. The worker had to be subordinated to achieve the object. There is no third way of controlling workers other than through value or through their own self-management. The elite has no place in history, and unfortunately the elite knows that it has no place in history. The elite has therefore been more insecure and thus more prone to use the use of force than probably any other modern ruling group. Growth is not simply a response to popular dissatisfaction, since the Soviet elite has never been reluctant to deal ruthlessly with the population. Growth is forced on the elite in order to avoid their own loss of power. In the initial NEP period, the elite found that the peasants held them to ransom in the absence of industrial goods. The elite therefore turned to industrialization. But then the elite found that an apparent high rate of growth failed to produce the necessary goods of the right quality at the right time and place. That too threatened their rule. On the other hand, no growth would exacerbate the problems of industry, ending the juggling act through which the elite maintained power. It is a juggling act because the elite effectively employed the surplus produced to patch up the problems of each period. Once the surplus ended, the system entered a terminal crisis. The system has necessarily to alternate between the use of direct command or force and bargaining and persuasion over time, since neither method actually works in the long term, although the alteration is useful in producing an increase in production and in damping the degree of dissatisfaction. Growth is thus a pragmatic response. Insofar as it proves to be counterproductive in preserving their position, the elite would stand opposed to growth. Today, the increasing intensity of the problems in the economy does raise the question of the necessity of growth. But the elite cannot dismiss the employed workforce without massive internal unrest. The term growth has to be defined. As ordinarily understood, growth might signify an increase in the net product of the society. More properly, growth refers to an increase in the surplus product produced. If defined in the first sense only, as signifying an increase in the net product of society, then no indication of future growth would be obtained, since in the extreme case the total consumption of the surplus would lead to stagnation. In the USSR, the increase in the net product is formal. More goods may be produced, but those goods may be useless for production. Thus, the existence of numerous uncompleted construction projects testifies to apparent growth, but these projects cannot be utilized. Similarly, tractors that break down quickly are used for purposes for which tractors that break down quickly or are used for purposes for which tractors are not intended can only mean that the USSR requires many more tractors than the United States, as indeed is the case. Indeed, the figures are startling. The USSR produces many more tractors than the United States because the USSR needs 585,000 tractors per year, whereas the USSR needs 150,000 per year. Nonetheless, the USSR has far fewer tractors per hectare in service than the United States. The Soviet tractors break down sooner and more frequently. Service and repairs cost 4 times the cost of production. Labor costs of service and repairs come to 4 to 6 times the original cost. Costs of production continue to rise by 4 to 5% per year. How then do we judge growth? The production of more goods that are useless does not permit for future growth. Growth in the Soviet sense, therefore, does not necessarily mean in addition to the surplus product. Rather, Growth in the Soviet sense signifies an increase in total goods produced, which is a very different thing. In other words, the sum use values diverges from the sum of goods produced. This indeed is the phenomenal form of the contradiction in the society. Thus, the elite are based on apparent growth, a growth that may employ more people, have more production, but not yet deliver the goods as real use values. These are really the elite's chimera. It is now possible to see Gorbachev's real problem more clearly. Gorbachev's aim is to turn the elite from an emasculated ruling group, terrified of losing power at every turn, both individually and collectively, into a class that is firmly in control of the surplus product. The pristine function of the elite, holding together a system that has no basis for being held together, can no longer be served. One might ask, if this is a function, whose purpose does this function serve? The only possible answer has to be that of the wider interest of the old order. The elite are, in fact, the despised yet tolerated partners of the bourgeoisie. The capitalist class would prefer them to surrender and transform the system back to capitalism. But the elite cannot do this itself, nor is it certain whether it is worth doing. To have an international diversion preventing the emergence of the new order is certainly preferable to a little more surplus value. The problem, however, is that the system can no longer be held together. The conflict of the laws is too sharp. For the conflict of the laws to be sustained, the conflict of the laws is too sharp for the system to be sustained for much longer. An orderly transition is required. For this purpose, Gorbachev has to turn on the working class. But unfortunately for Gorbachev, there is no obvious method of proceeding. Only the market will ensure the evolution of the elite into a class. But such a weak ruling group cannot easily establish control over the working class. Hence, Gorbachev has to proceed one step at a time, and if it is not Gorbachev, then it will be his successor who will act in a similar fashion. There really is no choice but to proceed cautiously. On the other hand, the whole elite and intelligentsia are not aware of their historic choices. Indeed, many decent individuals in the intelligentsia are demanding the market in the mistaken belief that the market is the only path to democracy. Despairing of genuine or revolutionary change, the intelligentsia necessarily turn to reform. Despairing of the working class, the Despairing of genuine or revolutionary change, the elite necessarily turn to reform. Despairing of the working class, the elite turn to the intelligentsia. Despairing of the concept of socialism, the elite turn to self-management within a market economy. Who is they? Sorry, I'm fucking this up. I'm going to repeat like a couple sentences. On the other hand, the whole elite and the intelligentsia are not aware of their historic choices. Indeed, many decent individuals in the intelligentsia are demanding the market in the mistaken belief that the market is the only path to democracy. Despairing of genuine revolutionary change, they necessarily turn to reform. Despairing of the working class, they turn to the intelligentsia. Despairing of the concept of socialism, they turn to self-management within a market economy. I'm not sure who they is, if he's referring to the elite, I'm guessing. As a result, most of the members of the contending factions stand in a confused position, as does Gorbachev himself, as explained above. In the final analysis, then, the elite are based on growth because of the inefficiency of the regime. The regime's instability and constant destruction of use values requires ever more use values. If the product were not contradictory in having use values that are only partially useful, then the elite could have a much lower growth rate. It is useful to follow out this train of thought. Clearly, the economy is an industrial economy. The elite themselves were never based on the peasantry, as in China, and hence their power has always rested on modern industry. However backwards that industry might be on a world scale, industry does have industry's own dynamic. In this case, it is the socialization of labor which demands solutions. Workers have to be better controlled as workers become more powerful, and technical improvements assist in this process. Hence, the classical Stalinist school is in favor of total computerization. The World Division of Labor demands that the USSR install new technique and control labor better, since the USSR has been insulated from the world market. This latter aspect has played a secondary role until the present. This internal dynamic might, however, have been slowed down, since it is contradictory in its operation. The cure for the increasing power of labor cannot ultimately lie through more industrialization, which in itself increases the power of labor. As a result, an alternative policy is one of adopting modern methods of control. This involves smaller plants, competition, smaller work groups, and the like, all of which amount to an attempt to replace the existing atomization with a frontal attack on the form of socialization itself. This in turn logically means a considerably reduced rate of industrial growth. At first, such a reduced rate would actually produce more real use values, but over time this effect would be played out. Then further growth would be counterproductive. Only direct pressure by workers for improved conditions of production and consumers for higher standard of living would cause growth. Under such conditions, the elite would vacillate between palliating demands from below and ignoring them, or perhaps even repressing them. The conclusion from such a look into Soviet dynamics, in the absence of the defective Soviet product, is that growth rates would vacillate and be quite slow. If this is indeed the case, it is probably true that this tendency is present today for the reasons given above, but it is masked by the real situation of the economy. Even now, the Soviet industrial growth rate of around 3 to 4% is high by world standards. The inefficiency of the economy incorporates the needs for an enormous and growing repair sector, an ever-devouring construction sector, and a constant need for new products to replace the old products that have failed. Failure here refers to the breakdowns of the products, such as tractors, and to the unusability of the goods for the process intended, such as a particular machine tool. In turn, the stocks of the different items grow either because of shortages and potential shortages, or because of their lack of use value. On this basis, clearly, growth can be enormous, with little impact on consumer goods. Nonetheless, the elite are driven by the nature of Soviet political economy to this high rate of growth. The contradiction is becoming absolute as modern integrated production, with modern specific skilled labor demands, precisely modeled products, delivered on time, to fit in with the modern highly turned labor processes. Solutions are demanded that are being provided on an ad hoc basis. But this basis is becoming less and less effective. A strategy is demanded. Today, the nature of the growth rate is much more in question. Arguments that the USSR was a worker state or expressed some element of superiority over capitalism through the USSR's high growth rate can no longer be sustained for empirical reasons. Soviet economists now argue that the USSR has expanded in gross national product by 7 times over the last 60 years. Not 90 times as Soviet statistics show. Furthermore, the inflation rate is now conservatively estimated at around 3% per annum in relation to the cost of living. It is higher for Department 1 goods and construction. If the inflation rate is 3% and the growth rate is 2.4%, what is the real rate of growth of the gross national product? Footnote. See Alec Nove, a further note on hidden inflation and hidden inflation's consequences, published in Soviet Studies, January 1988. Nova has summarized in this useful note the arguments of a number of Soviet economists, but most particularly that of Kanin and Selyunin in their article, something in Russian. Nova brings out the point that real wages did not increase in the period from 1976 to 1985. This article is a sequel to Nova's earlier article, Radical Reform, Problems and Prospects, published in Soviet Studies, July 1987, in which Nova provides an account of the arguments of Soviet economists. Back to the text. There is an argument that the USSR and the East European economies go through a cycle. Footnote. Joseph Goldman and Karol Kuba, Economic Growth in Czechoslovakia, published 1966, discussed the cycle for Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and the GDR, basing themselves on the prior work of Michael Koleski in particular, or Michal Koleski. For them, the basic causes lie in a lag between industry and the raw material base, as well as a voluntaristic aspect. In addition, there is a runaway investment problem, which is tackled using Keynesian analysis. Later analyses like that of the Institute of Economics of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, as exemplified by K. Seuss and also Thomas Bauer, Investment Cycles in Planned Economies, unpublished manuscript, place more emphasis in the fact that investment was not in fact controlled from the center and the voluntaristic aspect was secondary. Their descriptions conform more to reality, although their explanations remain purely empirical. Back to the text. To the extent that resources are increasingly absorbed in Department 1 or the repair sector without reappearing as a usable product, the system has to wind down in order to restore the rate of growth. The more realistic discussions on the nature of the economy, which began first in Hungary, show that the internal bargaining process necessarily had led to an explosive growth that inevitably wound down. The problem with their viewpoint, however, was that it lacked any theoretical basis. It simply described correctly a bargaining process under which investment, and particularly investment in new construction, went on increasing. The question was why it was permitted to do so. The answer was that the elite required expenditures on defense, and the economy also needed to grow in order to escape the economy's backwardness. While the power of the elite depended uniquely on a large heavy goods industrial sector. None of these arguments is sufficient. In the end, as history has shown, the elite did not succeed under any of these heads. A strong elite, after all, would leave the process to the process's enterprise's head. A strong elite, after all, would leave the process to its enterprise heads, trusting the enterprise's heads' judgments. The enterprise directors in the USSR, however, are themselves too weak in relation to the enterprise directors' workers to enforce the necessary labor discipline. The consequence is that all production is necessarily indeterminate in both the quality of output and the time for completion. As a result, the central elite, at this level, can never calculate correctly since the local enterprise itself cannot do so. Worse still, it is not in the interest of the local enterprise to tell the truth, as the center itself cannot cope with the truth. Since no one in the system knows the real situation, the center can only accede to requests to the maximum degree, in order to avoid a worse disaster. As argued above, it needs growth because it has such an enormous disparity between real use values and apparent use values. The reason is not growth itself, but the failure of the elite to maintain control over the surplus product. But it cannot assert control. It can only do the next best thing, which is to permit the system to operate by itself and intervene at the crisis points. Hence, as Thomas Bauer has put it, the center is too weak. Wikipedia says Thomas Bauer is a Hungarian economist, politician, and member of the National Assembly from June 28, 1994 to May 14th, 2002. Thomas Bauer's research areas are the Eastern European planned economies. Back to the text. But what is the center? It is the centralized economic arm of the elite itself. The elite is too weak. Not just because the elite has to accede to the increasing demands from below, since the elite cannot discriminate and determine what is necessary and important, but really because it prefers weakness. In theoretical terms, the contradiction between the real and apparent use values within the system leads to a cycle of explosive investment intended to break out of the contradiction. In principle, if growth could lead to the point where sufficient technologically advanced consumer goods were supplied to the population and improvement in technique could be self-sustaining, the elite would be stabilized. This hope rests on the possibility that workers would accept their fate as workers in return for a rising standard of living and relatively free life. In fact, the controls over labor have never been lifted, while the standard of living has risen too slowly to achieve the object. Hence, every dash for growth has failed. The instability of the elite leads to an unstable economy. As long as the increased investment did lead to the introduction of new techniques, more spare parts, and more factories, even if at enormous cost, the cycle was functional. The system itself provides a spontaneous solution. In the Stalin period, it simply absorbed more labor time, whether through employing more workers or using more labor more intensively through coercion. Imports have also been an alternative, particularly in the 1970s. The problem arose once the cost rose to such heights that low growth became the order of the day. That, in turn, meant that a halt could not easily be called. Under Khrushchev, there was a moratorium on new projects, but the subsequent unemployment was among the reasons for Khrushchev's fall. It became politically difficult to introduce the downturn phase. Instead, the process has led to permanently low real growth, even if total investment has continued to increase. Once investment itself could no longer serve as the instrument for temporarily overcoming the fundamental contradiction of the regime, the system had no choice but to abandon the system itself. It had to turn to the market. In a situation of acute crisis, the elite have tended to retreat, and hence we witnessed a decline in quality standards in the 1980s. On the other hand, it might be possible to apply more pressure to the workers through discipline, as under Andropov, or unemployment of a temporary kind, as under Khrushchev's moratorium. The point is that the Soviet elite do not have to assert control over surplus value, but rather over the labor process, from which stems the Soviet elite's instability. As the system struggles from crisis to crisis, it can now be seen that each period is characterized by the form of the crisis and the manner in which it has been handled. Under Stalin, it was dealt with through purges, camps, and forced labor. Under Khrushchev, an attempt was made to operate a bargaining system. Under Brezhnev, the market began to be introduced, failed, and was succeeded by a social peace punctuated only by attempts to find market-type surrogates to halt the system's manifest decline. Stalin represented direct force, Khrushchev organization, Brezhnev peace, and Gorbachev the market. None of these solutions has long-term viability, but each has performed a role in preserving the system. It can be seen, however, that the cycle has a drive towards more general change. The four aspects of the division of labor discussed above, and the subsequent theoretical discussion on the nature of the USSR, point to the inevitable conclusion that the USSR has reached a point where no economic reforms will work without concessions to the direct producers. An illustration of the problem is given by Gorbachev's expressed desire to end the emphasis on the construction of new plants. Over 10 years earlier, at the 25th Party Congress, this point was made and put on the agenda. The Soviet economist Sonin pointed out that labor discipline was the ultimate cause of all problems. Sonin argued in 1977 that the only way labor discipline could be tightened was to increase the level of mechanization in an existing plant. Sonin has also insisted that the construction of new plants had to be radically cut back. The same point is being made today, only more forcefully and repetitively. Okay, so there's a footnote here. It's in Russian, but I looked up Konstantin Sonin, who I think is being referred to here. Maybe I'm wrong. But, yeah, I'm not sure if this is the same guy, so I'm just going to skip this. Because he seems too young to be who's being referred to here. Yeah, no, he definitely is. No, it's a different Sonin that I have looked up. It's not Constantine Sonin, so forget what I said. No. Sorry. Back to the text. The immediate solution devised, as indicated above, have been to increase investment in existing plant as opposed to new plant, and to increase the proportion of investment in the producer goods industries shown in the 12th five-year plan. This cautious solution was hardly in accordance with the constant stress on the need for more and better quality consumer goods. But then without radical change, Gorbachev has no solution other than the appearance of change. Of course, the immediate solution has been followed by plans to introduce market-type reforms, but as of 1990, they remain very much a question of decrees and intentions rather than a reality, as indicated in our discussion of the contradictions of the reforms. Okie dokie. That is the end of this chapter, which has been titled, sorry, let me get back to the beginning. Come on. The Nature of the Soviet Political Economy. This is from Origins of the Crisis in the USSR by Hillel Ticktin. Thank you so much for listening.